In today's video, we're going to finish off our conversation about classical conditioning, and then we're going to move on and start talking about instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning. But first, we're going to pick up with stimulus generalization and a very closely related concept called stimulus discrimination. Now, this concept of generalization and discrimination doesn't just apply to classical conditioning. We're going to talk about it in terms of classical conditioning right now, but we can also have generalization and discrimination as part of operant conditioning as well. For our formal definition, we can say that stimulus generalization is a process where once a conditional stimulus has been established, meaning that it now reliably produces a conditional response, similar stimuli to our original conditional stimulus may also produce a conditional response. So what this means is that if we train a dog to salivate when they hear a particular bell, then maybe they'll also salivate when they hear a bell that's a little bit higher pitched or a little bit lower pitched, because bells are similar to other bells. So a similar stimulus might be producing a conditional response, maybe producing salivation, simply because it's associated with our original stimulus. And so if we want a visual example of what this might look like, we can look at this diagram here. So this graph has along the bottom lines of different orientations. We have vertical to horizontal. So the idea here would be that as we move from this side to this side, the line is going to turn. So being a little bit sort of diagonal, completely diagonal, almost vertical, vertical, and then back the other way. So think of this as a rotational angle of that line. And then this axis, our y-axis, is the strength of our conditional response. So if we were looking at salivation, that would be how much saliva is being produced. If we were looking at a startle response, we would be looking at some kind of ranking of how intense a startle response would be. And so when we read this, we see that we have the largest response or the most intense conditional response to this vertical line. So that tells us that that vertical line is probably our original conditional stimulus. So that would have been the stimulus that the animal was trained to produce a given response to. So if it was a dog salivating, that's where they were trained to salivate. And then as we slowly pivot that line so that it's off the diagonal, we still see quite a lot of responding, so that even a 45-degree angle on a diagonal is still getting quite a lot of salivation produced. So seeing this, we could say that the dog has generalized their responding and also salivates to other lines that are still slightly vertical. And this idea of sort of generalizing our responses goes hand in hand with our next concept, which is stimulus discrimination. And before I start on this, I just wanted to point out that I forgot to change the name in the definition I changed the title and I changed the definition itself, but I did not change the name in the definition for whatever reason. So this should be discrimination. So just adjust that in your notes before we go on any further. But stimulus discrimination is a process where we exhibit a less pronounced conditional response to stimuli that differ from our original conditional stimulus. So we would have a conditional response to one stimulus, probably our originally trained conditional stimulus, but not to another similar stimulus. So again, if we look at this same diagram, I suppose I don't need that line anymore, but if we look at this same diagram setup, so we have our angular lines on the x-axis and then our strength of conditional response on the y-axis, we still see lots and lots of responding to that vertical orientated line, saying that that was our original conditional stimulus. We see lots of responding or lots of salivation to that. But as soon as we deviate from vertical, as soon as there's even a slight angle, we see a very sharp drop-off in how much responding is produced to other orientations of lines. So this is why discrimination and generalization are very closely related concepts. So if we're talking about the fact that they respond differently to vertical lines and diagonal lines. They are sort of telling the difference between them. They respond one way to vertical and one way to diagonal. We could say that they're discriminating between those two orientations. They have shown a discrimination of those different angles. Whereas if we're talking about the fact that we get fairly high responding to both vertical and diagonal, if they respond fairly similarly to them, we could say that the animal has generalized. They're showing generalization to both of those angles. So if we're focusing on them being the same, if we're responding to both, then it's generalization. And if we're focusing on the difference, if we're saying that they're responding differently to both, then it's discrimination. And we'll actually talk a lot more about this concept of generalization and discrimination when I talk a little bit about my own operant conditioning research, looking at discrimination of sounds in black-capped chickadees. So we'll have sort of another chance to review these concepts when I do that before the midterm. The next concept that we're going to cover is higher order conditioning. And higher order conditioning is just a conditioning procedure where an already conditioned stimulus ends up being paired with a neutral stimulus. So this new neutral stimulus would become a conditioned stimulus and would then elicit a conditioned response. So we're actually going to use this as an opportunity to refresh the concept of basic conditioning before we tack onto it or add onto it in order to have higher order conditioning. So this diagram here is fairly similar to what we had seen previously. I will point out one difference from what we're used to seeing, and that is the fact that this uses the term unconditioned and conditioned instead of conditional and unconditional, like I've been trying to use for this lecture, or for, I guess, for this whole chapter. So this is just from an older text that uses the older terms, or a different term, I suppose. So I mentioned the whole conditional versus conditioned translation fiasco, but just don't worry about that. We're still looking at the same concepts, just a slightly different name here. So if this is going to be our first step, this is our normal classical conditioning. And so before conditioning, we have a tone. So kind of like how we were looking at a bell before, now we have a tone, something that produces a consistent sound. This does not produce any kind of response, no salivation. So this would be our neutral stimulus before we get started. And before conditioning, if you give a dog some food, we can call that an unconditional stimulus because they're going to produce an unconditional response. They're going to salivate when they're given the food. During conditioning, we're going to pair that neutral stimulus with our unconditional stimulus, and we're going to have produced our unconditional response. So the dog's going to salivate because they're still getting that food. And at the same time, this neutral stimulus, this tone, is going to become a conditional stimulus. So it's going to be acquired. It's going through that acquisition phase, and it will become a conditional stimulus. And after conditioning has happened, after that acquisition phase, we can confirm this. So if we present the tone to the dog in the absence of food, it's just the conditional stimulus, we get a conditional response. The dog salivates, which tells us that yes, this is a conditional stimulus. The dog did learn something about this particular stimulus, this previously neutral stimulus. So that's our original classical conditioning. This is also step one of our higher order conditioning, because higher order conditioning relies on the fact that we have an established conditional stimulus. So that's, we have an already conditioned signal or a already conditional stimulus that we would then pair with a neutral stimulus. So we've already set up a conditional stimulus. We already have our tone that elicits a conditional response. So now we can start the higher order conditioning. And specifically, this is second order conditioning because it's a second step, so sort of one extra step removed from normal classical conditioning. So before our higher order conditioning, we have a black square. which is our neutral stimulus. So a black square to a dog means nothing, there's no response here. If we showed the dog that conditional stimulus from this previous stage, if we show them that tone or let them hear that tone, they still produce that conditional response. That's where we're at before our higher order conditioning. And then during higher order conditioning, or during the second acquisition phase, we would pair our neutral stimulus, that black square, with our conditional stimulus from the last step. Here we've called it CS1, or conditional stimulus 1, because it was established sort of first. It's the first of what will become 2 conditional stimuli that we're going to be using here. And we see salivation from the dog, and here we would call this a conditional response, specifically because it's being driven by that pre-existing association with our first conditional stimulus. So that's the second acquisition stage, and then after that, after we've done this higher order conditioning, if we present the black square to the dog should salivate. They should produce that conditional response to just this black square. And so we can call this black square our second conditional stimulus, or our CS2, because it is now a conditional stimulus, and it's the second that we've used in this higher order chain of conditioning. So this is a very common tactic. Actually, most of the stuff that we learn nowadays through classical conditioning is through higher order conditioning. It's not very often that we have sort of that primary association with something like food. So we usually form associations with things that we already have associations with. And this is very, very prevalent in marketing and advertising, where companies focus on the fact that we already have pre-existing associations with different items. Say family dinner makes you feel warm and fuzzy, so they're going to show their product along with family dinner so that you also associate their product with feeling warm and fuzzy. So by tagging along their product, this black square, a previously neutral stimulus will become associated with the same thing that that first conditional stimulus had been associated with. So those warm, fuzzy feelings. To wrap up the concept of classical conditioning, we're going to talk a little bit about fears, phobias, and how we might get rid of those. So, of course, in psychology, whenever you talk about acquiring fears, our case study that we always bring up is the idea of little Albert. And so to begin here, I want to remind you about one of our behaviorists that we talked about early on in the course. So if you maybe remember, John B. Watson was credited with establishing the field of behaviorism. So this is that focus on our environment influencing our behavior. So everything that we learn, everything that we do is influenced by our external environment. And so Watson was famous for saying that as long as he had full control of the environment, any child that you gave him, he could turn them into anything. A doctor, a janitor, a mechanic, a criminal, anything, as long as he could control their environment. So he had this faith that the environment was driving everything that we learned, and thus how we behaved and reacted to the things that we encountered. And so as part of his research, Watson exposed a young child who they named Little Albert, just sort of as the way that they do with case studies, where we have, say, HM, and other acronym named individuals that I can't think of at the moment, where it was just intended to sort of protect people's privacy. But this young child, this little Albert, was exposed to a white rat. And of course, as I think he was 9 months old at the time, he had no preconceived notions about rats. He had never encountered one before. He didn't mind it. But while little Albert was interacting with the rat, Watson would condition a fear response. So he would do this by any time that Albert interacted with the rat, Watson would bang a gong in the background, a very loud, sudden, startling sound. And that startling sound would make Albert cry. And so eventually, anytime he touched this rat, he would start crying. And then anytime he saw the rat, he would start crying because there was a conditioned fear response. And we got to see generalization of this fear response because little Albert also responded to other stimuli that were similar to this furry white rat. So a white fur coat would elicit the same fear response. We also saw some discrimination because little Albert did not cry when he saw, I believe it was a Santa suit, which has sort of a white fur trim, but the rest of the coat was red, and for whatever reason, that was enough that he didn't produce that fear response to that particular coat. So there was some generalization where he treated other stimuli the same as that original furry white rat stimulus. And there was discrimination where he didn't respond the same to some other stimuli. So we see both of those concepts illustrated here. Because this is one of those concepts that gets talked about anytime we mention fear and learned fear specifically, there's been lots of interest in whatever happened to little Albert. I've heard a variety of different stories, and it seems to be one of those controversies that every time they think they have the answer, someone else comes up with new evidence and news stories and all of that. But what I've heard most recently is that little Albert, he had moved away with his mother. They stopped showing up to these sessions before he could have this conditioned fear removed, but it didn't negatively impact his life. He didn't love pets when he was older, but that was probably more due to the fact that he liked things clean as opposed to still being afraid of things that were furry and animalistic. There are other stories that things did not go as nicely, but I like the theoretical nice ending for that one. So this is establishing a fear. What happens if we want to get rid of a fear? One method that we can go about doing this is a process called systematic desensitization. And this process is generally used to treat very intense fears or especially phobias. So phobias are extreme and irrational fear that's directed towards people or objects or situations. So you might be agoraphobic and be afraid to go outside, or you might be arachnophobic and be afraid of spiders. There's lots and lots of different kinds of phobias. And if you actually continue on in introductory psychology, in Psych 105, you end up talking about different ways to treat sort of different fear responses and phobias and things like that. But we're going to talk about systematic desensitization or exposure therapy here, simply because it fits so nicely with our conversation about Pavlovian or classical conditioning. So it operates on the same principles. So we're going to talk about it very briefly here. But if it's something you're interested in, there's absolutely more to come. There's an entire chapter on treating psychological disorders in 105, so something to look forward to. But back to this, systematic desensitization is a therapeutic technique that's based on this idea of classical conditioning, with the intention of reducing a fear response. And so the idea here is, let's take someone with a fear of spiders. And so you want to systematically get them used to encountering spiders. So we're going to put them through extinction. So we would show them at the beginning, maybe we start with a cartoon picture of a spider. And we want that person to get as close to that picture as possible. And the more they're exposed to that image, that conditional stimulus, and they're not experiencing any bad outcome, they're not experiencing the fear that comes from, say, being touched by a spider or bit by a spider or whatever it is that makes them feel afraid, they would sort of become desensitized or accustomed to this feeling. And their conditional response, that fear response, would gradually lessen. And we would start with, say, a picture of a spider, or I guess a cartoon first, and then a photo of a spider, and then maybe a spider in a tank. And then maybe eventually they'd get to the point where they could sit with a spider or even touch a spider and not have as extreme of a fear response because we've extinguished or because that conditional response has gone through extinction and they no longer feel fear. So that's one of the uses of systematic desensitization. So you gradually expose them to the thing that they're afraid of until they no longer exhibit that fear response. All right, and that is it for classical conditioning. Next, we're going to move on to instrumental or operant conditioning. And this I had listed previously also as behavior event learning. So we talked about event alone learning. That was our habituation, where we had a stimulus and we learned something about that stimulus in isolation. Then we had our classical conditioning, and that was event learning. And we learned something about the association between two stimuli. Well, now instrumental or operant conditioning is behavior event learning. So we're going to learn something about a behavior or a response and an event or outcome that follows that response. So for our definition here, operant or instrumental conditioning is learning that is controlled by the consequences of an organism's behavior. And the basic steps for operant conditioning is that we start with some kind of stimulus, something that tells us that we can make a response. We will make a particular response, and then there is some kind of outcome, and that outcome might be good or bad, and the results of that outcome will tell us if we should make that response again in the future if we're ever faced with that same stimulus again. And this will start making more sense as we walk through some of the different sort of concepts and procedures involved here. But operant conditioning, which was originally just called instrumental conditioning, came about because of E.L. Thorndike. Edward Thorndike is famous for his law of effect, which states that if a response in the presence of a stimulus is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between stimulus and response will be strengthened. So basically, if you do a particular behavior, if you make a particular response when you're faced by a stimulus, you make a particular response and the outcome is good, then you're more likely to do that response again if you're ever faced with that stimulus again. So we strengthen the relationship between our stimulus and our response. So if we result in satisfaction, so if it's a good thing, we have a process called stamping in, where we make that association stronger and we become more likely to do that response, to do that particular behavior in the future. If that sort of stimulus and then response is followed by a negative outcome or a dissatisfaction, I don't think that's a word. Let's go with discomfort, which is what I wrote on the slide, probably for obvious reasons. So if it ends up resulting in something bad happening, there's a bad outcome, then we would stamp out that behavior. We basically make it less likely for that behavior to occur in the future. So if you do something and it gets you in trouble, then maybe you're less likely to do that in the future because that behavior led to something bad happening. So you won't do it again. So we weaken that particular response. So if you strengthen the response, if it's followed by a satisfying or good event, we do it more. If it's followed by a bad or discomfortable situation, then you're not going to do it more. You're going to stamp out or weaken that association. And all of this came about because of Thorndike's focus on his puzzle boxes. And these are kind of a strange setup. So we have an example of them here, where Thorndike worked with a bunch of cats. Specifically, they were cats that had briefly been food deprived, so they were hungry at the time. And they were placed in boxes that had very complicated escape routes. So here in this one, they have sort of a foot pedal that they needed to operate in order to open the door to escape. Sometimes they involved latches or levers or buttons or whatever. So these had complicated escape routes that he called puzzles, hence the name puzzle box. So these cats would have to escape from this box. And as motivation, Thorndike would place either milk or food outside of the box so that when the cat escaped, they quickly got food and nourishment, which was very motivating to these hungry cats. Now, with this experiment, Thorndike's goal was to actually differentiate between two different theories of sort of improvement in performance or learning. And I'm actually going to hop back and forth between these two slides. This is another example of this same basic graph here. So we have time required to escape So how long it took the animal to get out of the box, where a sort of a higher score means that it took them a long time to get out, and a low score means that they got out very quickly. And then along the bottom, we have number of trials. So just how long have they been experiencing this particular device? So if we look at this sort of idealistic graph here, this was what he was looking for, was a difference between two different kinds of learning. The first is, actually I can draw it in over this with my lines. So if we look at this line with the triangles, this is the original idea. So people thought that animals were showing insight, that they had sort of an aha moment when they were looking or facing a problem and they would sort of suddenly figure it out and then know what to do. And so if this insightful or non-incremental improvement was actually what was going on, then we would see that the cats would take a very, very, very long time to escape. They might not escape at all. They might time out. And then all of a sudden there would be a trial where all of a sudden they do really, really well. So they take a very long time to escape up here, or maybe they don't escape at all. And then suddenly they have that insight, that aha moment at sort of this point in time. Sort of that's when that would occur to them. And then all of a sudden they can escape very, very quickly because now they know how it works. So if he saw a sort of a line that looked like this, then he would call it insight. But instead, he saw something that was a little bit closer to this second line with the circles. And so this is for incremental improvement in performance, or sort of a trial and error approach. And so if we look at this graph, we would see that at the beginning, it would take the cats a very, very long time to escape, just like before, because they don't know what they're doing. But gradually, they would start figuring it out, and each trial, they would improve just a little bit, hence incremental improvement. So they'd improve a little bit, we'd see a gradual improvement as eventually they'd figure out how it works, and eventually they'd be able to solve it fairly quickly. And so Thorndike was looking for which of these two things is happening, and specifically wanting to show that it wasn't insight, it was, in fact, this incremental improvement in performance. So we were learning through trial and error, we gradually learn from the consequences of our actions. So the things that led to a satisfying turn of events, the things that led to the cats getting out of the box, those were good and should be done more often. And the things that did not lead to good things, like getting out, if they led to you still being stuck in the box, you should do them less often. So we would see sort of this kind of a line. And then if we look over here, this is a little bit messier because it's real data, not theoretical data. But at the beginning, we see that we tend to take more time overall, and towards the end, the cats took less time overall. So we do see evidence that, yeah, incremental improvement is closer to what we actually observe. And if this is something you'd like to learn just a little bit more about, I have a link here to a video that actually shows some puzzle boxes in action and talks a little bit more about this difference between incremental improvements and insightful performance. So that's just an option if you are interested. Thorndike's ideas, and especially his law of effect, heavily influenced Skinner and his sort of outcome, this operant process. So because what, actually hopping back here, because what Thorndike was doing usually involved these animals using instruments, these boxes with different levers and pedals and things, the process was called instrumental conditioning. That's where that part of the name comes from. But when Skinner came and sort of overhauled the system, when he added to it and kind of made it his own, he was focusing in on the operant process. So because it wasn't just using a particular device, we sort of generalized the term to become an operant. And an operant is sort of an action that you take that leads to some sort of outcome, hence the name. But we might remember Skinner, we had talked about him as a radical behaviorist. So just like Thorndike was a behaviorist, Skinner was the same, but even more so. He focused on the fact that the mind had absolutely nothing to do with sort of learning and behavior, and he focused entirely on the environment. So Skinner went so far as to say that through this operant process, he could teach everything that humans could do. He could go so far as to explain things like language acquisition with this operant conditioning, which was quite the claim at the time. But Skinner is famous for identifying a lot of the key processes that take place during this operant conditioning, and he's credited with the creation of the Skinner box, or sometimes also called an operant chamber. So we have an example of an operant chamber at the bottom here. I call them operant chambers just because that's what I was taught. But if you see Skinner box, same thing. With these chambers, you're usually going to see them associated with rats or pigeons. Those are our two big model organisms for this type of research. But within this box, you'll usually have sort of a series of things you can interact with. So here they have a bar or a lever that the rat can depress. There are two lights at the top, sort of red and green. You can usually swap those out for different things. And especially nowadays, some of these operant chambers have gotten really complicated. And instead of having this set up with sort of lights, fixed lights and a bar, I've seen ones, especially with pigeons, that say rely on touch screens. So you can set the same thing up, but with better technology and more accurate recording nowadays. But this is how it started. And so in here, they'd have access to water. Water is usually given access all the time, just because it's essential to stay alive. They would also have food, but food would be delivered as sort of a consequence of your performance. So if you answered correctly, you would get food, and then if you did not, you would not get food. And during these processes, sort of an operant process would usually take only sort of a short amount of time. Or if they last for longer than that, then food output is very closely monitored to make sure that the animal gets enough food. Just sort of making us aware of the ethical concerns here. So we would always monitor the food output to make sure that the animal wasn't going without. And the neat part about this box was that it would also have some kind of recording device. So it used to be that anytime this lever was depressed, it would send sort of an indicator to, say, a needle on paper, and it would show whenever a response had been made. Nowadays, again, we can do this through computers. We can record, say, exactly when something happened, or the intensity that something happened, or whatever else we set it up to document. But these operant chambers give us this ability to sort of set up situations where we can control their behavior. We can teach them different things and different connections. We can record their output, and we can adjust what kind of reinforcement, what kind of, say, delivery of consequences occurs. So a pretty neat controlled environment, and this is where a lot of our understanding of operant conditioning came from, is within these operant chambers. Now, we've talked about this concept of our stimulus, response, and outcome, but you might also see these referred to by slightly different terms. So our preceding stimulus, Skinner would have called this an antecedent. So something detectable in the environment that sets the occasion for us to respond. So in an operant chamber, it might be a cue light, a red light that comes on and says that you can begin a trial when you're ready. So we use red lights in our operant conditioning with our chickadees. They're fairly common, and they just let the animal know that you can begin a trial. Our behavior would be our response, some kind of activity that can be repeated and measured and has an impact on the environment. So that behavior might be pushing a lever. That would be a response to an antecedent. So when the cue light is on, when you push the lever, then you might get food. So pushing the lever is your measurable behavior. And then our consequence is sort of a stimulus or event that can increase or decrease the probability of future behavior. So our consequence is the outcome. So if you push that lever and you get food, you're more likely to push that lever in the future. If you push that lever and the lights go out and it's dark, then maybe you're less likely to push the lever in the future. So they can be good or bad and can increase or decrease the probability of a behavior occurring in the future. So just as a sort of direct comparison here, so we have stimulus response outcome, that's how we started. We could also call this antecedent behavior consequence. Same basic concept, just slightly different terminology according to Skinner's preferences. While we're on the topic of consequences, I want to talk briefly about a term that our textbook mentions, and this is the idea of differential consequences. So differential consequences is when different responses will yield different consequences. So the example they give is that if we have our experimenter prompt or our antecedent of give me the file or give me the clip, if the child produces say the correct response, so if they're asked for a file and they give a file, if they're asked for a clip and they give a clip, each of these sort of chains of events will lead to different or differential consequences. Correctly handing them the file will get them a chip, and correctly picking up the clip will get them a cookie. Now, this doesn't seem to mean a whole heck of a lot to us. You do a task and you get some kind of reward for completing that task. But it's actually interesting because the fact that each of these sort of chains of events leads to a different consequence, we actually see differences in rate of learning. So when there is a distinct consequence for each behavior chain, then we can end up with faster learning. So for example, if we did the same setup, here they're asking for a nail versus a socket, and in both cases the child does the correct thing, and the consequence for both of those is the exact same outcome, you get the same consequence, the learning in non-differential consequences is slower than equivalent setups using differential consequences. So by having these distinct consequences for each action helps us learn that process a lot faster. So we see faster learning when we experience differential consequences, and we experience slower learning when we have non-differential consequences. So something about having this sort of distinct and individual consequence aids in our learning process when we're learning something through an operant conditioning process, which is pretty cool. All right, so our next topic is to talk about reinforcement contingencies. Now, a contingency is just sort of an if-then rule, so like a logic rule, where we say that if you do this particular behavior, then that particular consequence will happen. So if this, then that. So a contingency is just us setting up what the rules are for our operant setup. And if we hop back to this slide here, we're saying if you do this response or this particular behavior, then you will get this particular outcome or consequence. Basically, that's all it's telling us. And we can have different kinds of sort of consequences. We have mostly focused on consequences where something good happens and we are more likely to do a behavior in the future. That would fall under the category of reinforcement. So any outcome or any consequence that strengthens or increases the probability of a particular response being produced. So if you push that lever and you get food, food is good. So that would be reinforcement because you're now going to be more likely to push that lever in the future. In contrast, we can have punishment, which is any outcome that weakens or reduces the probability of a response being done in the future. So I actually used an example of this earlier. So if you push that lever and the lights turn out, that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing. So pushing the lever and the lights go out means that you would be less likely to push that lever in the future. So we could call that punishment. In addition to classifying a contingency as either reinforcement or punishment, we can talk about it as being either positive or negative. And positive and negative don't have anything to do with whether it's followed by a good or a bad outcome. That's still covered under reinforcement or punishment. Instead, positive refers to the fact that we add a consequence, and negative refers to the fact that we have removed a consequence. And so this is going to make more sense when we put it all together. So let's look at this diagram here where we have reinforcement and punishment, but we also have positive and negative. So if we have positive reinforcement, we know that we are applying a stimulus, and specifically we're applying a stimulus that increases the frequency of the desired behavior. So this would be the example of you push the lever and you get food. So you're being given a stimulus, you're being given something, food, and by being given that good thing, you are more likely to do that behavior, pushing the lever, in the future. If we stick with the positive, we can stay with sort of applying a stimulus, but now positive punishment. So we're applying a stimulus that decreases the frequency of an undesirable behavior. So punishment is going to decrease the likelihood that we produce that behavior in the future. So maybe when you push the lever, there's a loud sound that plays, and it's loud and scary. So that would be positive punishment because you're adding that sound, you're adding a stimulus, and it's a bad thing. So it's going to mean that you're less likely to push that lever in the future if it leads to the production of that bad sound. Okay, well, what about our negatives, removing a stimulus? So we can have negative reinforcement. So if you remove a stimulus, and it ends up increasing the frequency of a desirable behavior, maybe you're removing something bad, so they're more likely to do that in the future. An example of this would be, say, taking a painkiller when you have a headache. So by taking that painkiller, you are removing the bad thing. You are getting rid of that headache. And because taking your painkiller ended up removing your headache, you ended up feeling better, you are more likely to take a painkiller in the future to get rid of that bad feeling in the future. And that leaves us with negative punishment, so the removal of a stimulus that would lead us to decrease the frequency of an undesirable behavior. So this would be removing something good so that we are less likely to do that behavior in the future. So maybe as a kid, when you were misbehaving, your parents would take away your TV time. So they're removing something that you enjoyed, which was watching TV, and it made you less likely to act badly in the future so that you didn't lose your TV time in the future. So that would be negative punishment. And the textbook includes lots and lots of examples for each of these. So I hope that you will take some time and figure out the difference between sort of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, because there is almost always at least one or two questions that asks you to make a differentiation between these different kinds of reinforcement contingencies. And we can actually go even one step further, and we can break our negative reinforcement down into two additional categories, where we can talk about escape and avoidance behavior. So escape behavior is when the performance of a behavior terminates an aversive stimulus. So you take an Advil when you have a headache so that the headache goes away. The bad thing is occurring, and then you do an action to get rid of that aversive or bad stimulus. Avoidance behavior is a little bit different because it involves us to learn something about what's coming up in the future. So avoidance behavior involves the performance of a behavior that prevents an aversive stimulus from occurring at all. So maybe the weather is going to be particularly bad, and you know that you always get headaches when the weather is bad, so maybe you take a preventative Advil before the bad weather starts so that you don't get a headache at all. That would be avoidance behavior. So escape behavior is where the aversive stimulus is occurring, so you do something to escape it. But avoidance behavior is when you know the aversive stimulus would come and you do something to avoid it ever happening. So both of these are based on that idea of negative reinforcement, but they involve sort of slightly different aspects of learning. So this diagram here does a great job of sort of breaking this down. So escape conditioning would be more along the lines of negative reinforcement as we talked about it the first time through. And then avoidance is something that adds just that extra step where we know what's coming in the future. And so this summarizes all of those terms very, very neatly. So this would be a really good diagram to become familiar with and to get used to. So if we've talked about all of these different types of reinforcement contingencies, which one is the best one to be using? And it can really depend on the situation. The one that's mostly preferred is positive reinforcement, where you add an appetitive or a good stimulus following the correct behavior. And that's because this type of reinforcement isn't necessarily ethically dubious. It's not a bad thing to give someone something good, which we'll see changes a little bit when we get into some of our punishment. Positive reinforcement also has an added benefit where you don't have to reinforce every single occurrence of that behavior for it still to work. Even if you tell your child that they've done a good job every once in a while, that's still going to be reinforcing or encouraging that behavior. Whereas something like positive punishment, where you're trying to reduce the occurrence of a bad behavior, you almost have to do it every single time to get the behavior to stop. So it's easier to focus on encouraging a desired behavior, and it's a lot harder to stop an undesired behavior. There are also ethical issues with punishment, and we actually have a nice summary of these on the next slide. So punishment alone just tells them what they shouldn't do, but it doesn't tell them what they should be doing instead. It doesn't give them an alternative. Punishment involves aversive stimuli, and some aversive stimuli can be problematic. So if you did something that caused pain or discomfort, that's not a good thing. It is ethically dubious depending on the situation. There are also issues where the individual who delivers punishment, if it works the first time, then you're actually reinforced to do that behavior again. So you might end up using punishment more and more often despite all of these other issues with it. So that's one of the reasons why it's encouraged not to rely on punishment. And the person whose behavior is punished also learns to use punishment to control others' behavior. So there's that sort of learning, having observed someone else successfully use that technique. So then if you're using positive punishment on a child, they might then use it on other children as well. And just like I said, punishment can only be really effective if you use it every single time, if you use it then immediately, or if it is sufficiently aversive to prevent that behavior from occurring. So it's very difficult to deliver punishment on these sort of strict rules. It's a lot easier to reinforce the good behaviors than it is to try and punish the sort of undesirable behaviors. So for that reason, we're mostly focusing in on, say, positive reinforcement or even negative reinforcement, and we very rarely see punishment, and especially we're very, very rare to see positive punishment, just for all of these reasons here.